Dropping into the highest court in the land here on BBC4 this evening at 10. But first, the power of TV to do good. Overturning some 18 convictions over 25 years, Timeshift recalls some rough justice.
In December 1983, a man walked free from prison after serving 6 years of a sentence for a murder which he did not commit. His name was Mervyn "Jock" Russell, and he was the first man in British history to have a conviction quashed as a result of a television programme.
What has this experience meant for your life?
Hell. Pure hell.
For centuries, British justice was considered infallible.
And then these twerps from the telly come in, who aren't even lawyers, and start poking their finger in it.
Trussed up with her.
In the 1980s, British television, led by a series called Rough Justice, mounted a sustained attack on the British criminal justice system, uncovering miscarriage after miscarriage.
What this is doing is showing us that mistakes are made in the judicial system, not just rarely, but they're actually embedded in the system. In other words, they come not as single spies, but in battalions.
The judiciary struck back.
After a decision has been given by judge and jury, the media must not go round trying to get what they call fresh evidence so as to show, if they can, the decision was wrong.
It was a system in denial.
Any system that's at fault becomes stronger by those in charge admitting to the problem. It's like an alcoholic recognising his drink problem.
This is the story of how the BBC television series Rough Justice ignited a chain of events that would transform the criminal justice system, television journalism, and the lives of many innocent people.
The court of last resort is actually at work today, investigating cases throughout the United States.
The idea of using television to investigate miscarriages of justice was not a new one.
A group of 7 men, experts in law and criminology, bound together in their dedication to improving the administration of justice.
In the late 50s, American crime novelist Earl Stanley Gardner had created The Court of Last Resort, a television series that examined real-life cases.
Earl Stanley Gardner, who was the creator of Perry Mason, had used some of the money that he'd accumulated from his successful crime novels to start something called the Court of Last Resort, which was a totally extrajudicial body, but which looked at particular cases to determine whether or not anything had gone wrong.
Such a program was made possible in the United States by the freedom of the press, guaranteed by the Constitution's First Amendment. But in post-war Britain, television was dominated by a still deferential BBC, which owed its very existence to a royal charter. The notion of using television to overturn the work of a British court was unthinkable. This was hallowed ground. Places like the Old Bailey only ever permitted cameras inside for ceremonial occasions.
One of the interesting things about the judiciary, there was a sense in which it was still entirely Dickensian. At that time, the idea that a case was going to be brought before it as a result of work by journalists was something that was anathema to some of those judges.
But the 70s and 80s saw a new breed of investigative journalism find its voice. And in 1982, the unthinkable actually happened. Britain's first television series dedicated solely to reversing miscarriages of justice, challengingly titled Rough Justice. It would run on the BBC for 25 years. Each programme concentrated on a separate case. It had one aim: to free an allegedly innocent person. It was produced by Peter Hill and presented by Martin Young.
Peter's mad idea was, give us a load of Alliance of Spares money, we'll go off around the country, we can't guarantee you that we will ever find a story. You just wouldn't get that these days.
Rough Justice was given a great amount of leeway. This was a time when the BBC faced less competition. There were just 3 channels to choose from, and 2 of those were BBC. For their first case, they selected a murder committed some 5 years earlier. A man had entered a young student's flat in South London, grabbed the neck of her jumper with his left hand, and with his right, stabbed her dead. Before she was struck, she wrenched a handful of hair from her assailant's head. The killer was disturbed at the scene and was spotted dropping 30 feet from a third-floor balcony. He escaped unchallenged. Within weeks, a man was arrested for the murder and sentenced to life.
Prisoner B04208 is locked up in Albany Prison on the Isle of Wight. His crime, murder. His name, Mervyn Jock Russell. Russell was convicted in 1977 for stabbing a young girl to death. Russell got a life sentence, which he's still serving in Albany Prison.
The Russell conviction was suspicious primarily because of one piece of forensic evidence discovered at the scene.
In her right hand, the police found 22 strands of human hair. 4 were dark, the rest were grey or colourless.
The key clue was that as she fell down, the girl had grabbed the murderer's hair, and this hair in her hand was not Russell's hair.
Jock Russell's hair was jet black.
The prosecution tried to say that she'd picked it up as she was dying off the floor. There were 21 hairs in her hand altogether. No.
For the programme, the conclusion was inescapable.
We already know that there is enough reasonable doubt about the conviction of Jock Russell. Yet here he stays in Albany Prison. If he behaves himself, he could be released by 1993. By then, he'll be almost 50, and he'll have spent the bulk of his adult life in prison for a crime which he almost certainly did not commit.
The first episode of Rough Justice was watched by 11 million viewers in prime time on BBC One, a big number even in the 3-channel environment of the early 1980s. Despite the millions tuning in, the programme was aimed at a much more specific audience.
There was this peculiar way in which Rough Justice knew precisely what it was doing. Now, there was a famous moment in the 1970s when Peter Jay was asked about his economics column in the Times, and he said, oh, that's just written for 3 people. In other words, the 3 mandarins at the Treasury who were going to determine fiscal policy. However, you could also argue that Rough Justice was made for 3 people. It was made for the 3 Court of Appeal judges who were ultimately going to hear the appeal when it reached the Court of Appeal.
Rough Justice knew that the only thing that would sway the appeal court judges was new evidence not presented at the original trial.
It's understood that what you needed to get a quashing of a conviction was new evidence at trial. So here now was the programme that was actually doing exactly what the judicial system required, and which was bringing the new evidence that was going to impact on the Court of Appeal to make sure that a conviction could be overturned.
Today it seems unimaginable that evidence as crucial as hairs found in a victim's hand could be so ignored. Yet this was a time of very different police procedure.
Forensic evidence was in its infancy, and you had police officers, ordinary constables, picking up guns or knives from the scenes of crime using their handkerchiefs in order to try not to smudge fingerprints.
It looks a little shallow, Holmes, but it is in fact well worthwhile.
The police were also able to influence what evidence was passed on to the court.
In a lot of investigations, there is an enormous amount, a really enormous amount of evidence that is accumulated. The difficulty with allowing the police any sort of filter on that is that the police will filter out evidence that is helpful to the defence, evidence that could easily acquit the suspected person.
Rough Justice was very much a product of its time. A television programme from a national broadcaster where the money could be spent not on screen, but on behind-the-scenes research. So much about it was different from the ratings-driven shows of today.
What's interesting about the Rough Justice cases is that they were made in a particularly forensic way, and that they were very detailed. And I think today it might be thought of as slow television. Television executives these days would think, well, this isn't the kind of thing we're looking for.
The Jock Russell case became a template for rough justice. As the rest of the series followed, the implication was clear. This was not an isolated miscarriage.
What this is doing is showing us that mistakes are made in the judicial system, not just rarely, but they're actually embedded in the system. In other words, they come not as single spies, but in battalions.
I think that rough justice perhaps opened the public's mind and the mind of perhaps elites within society that actually the system can get it wrong, and maybe it doesn't get it wrong as rarely as we think it gets it wrong. In that respect, I think rough justice really was quite groundbreaking.
Rough justice could be confident in the cases it was questioning because they were able to draw on the files of influential legal reformer Tom Sargent, secretary of the organisation Justice.
Tom Sargent in the sort of 80s and late 70s was a giant, and if you were talking miscarriages of justice, you were talking with Tom Sargent.
Tom Sargent was uncovering lots of miscarriages of justice, but didn't initially have a means of bringing them to public attention. Tom Sargent knew about the Court of Last Resort, the American TV series.
George Zacco was arrested and tried for murdering his wife Anna by poisoning her with arsenic.
He was very keen to import that idea and to get a television series in exactly the same way going in this country. And so, curiously, he was actually waiting to meet someone like Peter Hill, who was going to produce that sort of programme. That was his destiny.
Hill and Sargent eventually met in the early 1980s.
When I saw all the files that Justice had, I thought there must be something in this. I mean, I'd been an investigative journalist for many years, and I realised that what you need is documents, you see. There were all these files.
That was a fantastic combination, where you had a lobbying organisation, a highly committed and established person like Tom, who knew how to handle the press, also knew the politicians and the lawyers, allied with a TV programme that had the resources and the commitment.
From the very first Rough Justice transmission, the programme's searches for new evidence were attacked by prominent members of the judiciary.
After a decision has been given by judge and jury, the media must not go round trying to get what they call fresh evidence so as to show, if they can, the decision was wrong. That is undermining our system of justice altogether.
Are you saying that the system and the integrity of the system and the public conception of the integrity of the system is more important than the fate of, say, one or two individuals?
Certainly. The integrity of our system of justice and upholding it is one of the foundations of society.
I think it was idiotic of Denning to have said that the system was more important than the individuals. I mean, the system and the individuals should be as important as each other. The system needs to have confidence in it. Any system that's at fault becomes stronger by those in charge admitting to the problem. It's like an alcoholic recognising his drink problem. You don't make things better, you don't solve the difficulty until you recognise it and own up to it.
The idea that organisations improve by admitting their failings is a modern one. For a judiciary rooted firmly in the past, which didn't even have press offices until the 1980s, any form of media intrusion was unwelcome. And it wasn't just the legal establishment that preferred television keep its nose out. The police, too, had much to hide.
I joined in 1980, and very early on as a temporary detective, was very, very strongly told confinement brings confession. In 1980, we pre-prepared the confessions. We wrote them out before we actually sat down with the people, and we got them to sign them. They weren't their words. There was no doubt about the kind of conspiracy between judges, magistrates and cops, and the sort of nods and the winks that went on in the court.
But the police could now find themselves not just fighting crime, but allegations from rough justice as well.
I don't think there was a police officer serving who didn't know about rough justice, and the attitude towards it was one of great suspicion and a fear, really. Programmes such as that, investigative journalism of that sort, clearly was going to unearth unprofessional conduct or even corrupt practice within the police service. And some police officers were very much afraid of being found out.
The stakes were upped considerably for the criminal justice system when, on the 6th of December 1983, Mervyn "Jock" Russell, the man at the centre of the first rough justice programme, walked free.
A man who was jailed for life 6 years ago for murder has been set free by the appeal court. Mervyn "Jock" Russell was found guilty by an Old Bailey jury of stabbing an art student to death at her flat in South London. But there was concern that the verdict had been based on flimsy evidence.
The Jock Russell case was the first ever case that was quashed as a result of a single television programme. Prior to that, I think we'd needed an accumulation of concern, of media concern about particular cases.
It had taken nearly 2 years, but they had finally done it. Rough Justice marked this historic event with a special programme following Jock Russell's first steps into freedom.
Peter and I were obviously absolutely delighted. We had lots of press there, obviously. And of course, Jock Russell had gate fever, something I'd never heard of before, but, you know, it was very evident.
Gate fever is the sense of disorientation that can follow release from prison. 6 years inside had clearly taken their toll.
He was shaking. He was confronted by, you know, this media frenzy, and he was completely out of his depth. So he was in a mess.
What has this experience meant for your life?
Health. Pure health.
As with most miscarriages, the real perpetrator of the crime was never prosecuted, denying closure to both the victim's family and Russell himself.
It was a very bleak programme because conditions for him were still very bad, compensation was yet to get through.
As I understand it, it could take anything up to a year before he gets the money, and that doesn't seem to be right, that the state should make him go cap in hand.
I'd have thought a year after his conviction was quashed, he was begging around Deptford trying to find a job and such. He was penniless, I would say, and it's a very sad tale.
Jock Russell was the archetypal rough justice case. Low profile, the kind no one else would champion.
With rough justice, these were ordinary people who had got themselves in a mess by one way or another and found themselves in jail for years and years and years and years and didn't know what to do about it.
In taking the side of the little man, rough justice had picked a fight with the establishment. It was not alone. The early 80s saw tension rise between Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government and the media generally.
Certainly by the time the Thatcher government came in, I think because of the Thatcher government's natural antipathy and vice versa to journalists, it was very tempting for journalists to look for ways of attacking the establishment that they saw being represented and incarnated by that.
These were hugely sensitive times, with the Falklands War being the sort of focal point of that. You had a Conservative government with a very powerful Prime Minister, Mrs. Thatcher. There was a very feisty and sometimes tricky relationship between the BBC and number 10 Downing Street.
The BBC was accused by the government of revealing British military positions to the enemy during the Falklands War.
There's a stage in the coverage of any conflict where you can begin to discern the level of accuracy of the claims and counterclaims of either side. It seems likely that the British have now withdrawn most of their ships to regroup and rethink. And the task force appears to be centred on the carriers 100 miles or so east of the Falklands. But if there's been no action today, a little more information...
Other BBC programmes were criticised for their coverage of the troubles in Northern Ireland. Such clashes between government and media were becoming frequent.
The BBC is in a very uncomfortable place because whenever it does anything that looks political, in a way, and Rough Justice very clearly was in some senses a political programme, there was a small p, it looks as if that programme is against the government.
There was the BBC suddenly questioning the judiciary, suddenly questioning the police, suddenly raising the spectre that there could be miscarriages of justice and arguing on the BBC that they should be investigated. When you add that, what now seems a toxic mix, to the already turbulent relationship that was going on between the government and the BBC, then no wonder that it was a sort of heady, tricky, difficult time.
But rough justice paid little heed to the delicate political landscape. The Jock Russell case had vindicated its approach. In 1985, now in its third series and with confidence soaring, rough justice tackled a case of reported burglary committed in Manchester 2 years earlier. 2 men had broken into the flat of Anne Fitzpatrick, a 30-year-old market stall holder. They entered her bedroom, striking her across the face, then smothering her screams with a pillow. They bound her wrists and her ankles. They carried her to the front door before looting the flat and escaping. Fitzpatrick alerted her upstairs neighbour by straining her head to the doorbell. Shortly after, a man named Anthony Mycock was convicted of the crime.
Prisoner N17033, Anthony Mycock, is currently serving a 5-year sentence for robbery with violence at Franklin Prison in Durham. Rough justice can now show that Anthony Mycock is totally innocent. The proof of that, the absolute proof in this case, is the most remarkable evidence we've ever discovered.
The case revolved around the testimony of the only witness, Anne Fitzpatrick, who was also the victim.
He had light brown hair which came down onto his forehead, and on his hand he had a tattoo at the base of the thumb going to the wrist. It was about 1 inch big and was shaped like a helmet.
Anthony Mycock had a tattoo on his hand. He was the right age, the right build, the right height. He was charged not with assault, but with robbery, even though none of the stolen goods were ever found in his possession.
Mycock's tattoos were nothing like Fitzpatrick had described, nor was his hair, and his ears had never been pierced. Yet he was convicted solely on Fitzpatrick's testimony.
After close cross-examination by defense counsel, she looked across the courtroom at Anthony Mycock and said,
I say that is the man that came into my room that evening.
But this was a robbery with a difference.
The Mycock case just seemed odd. She claimed to have been attacked during this burglary, and indeed the sentence was premised on the basis that she had been violently attacked, yet there was no evidence whatever of her having suffered any injury.
Further investigation was needed.
We went round and we talked to all the flatmates of Anne Fitzpatrick. She said that a lot of jewellery, some of it sounds quite expensive, she said a lot of jewellery had gone. Did you believe that?
No.
How did you find Anne Fitzpatrick?
She was sitting with her back to the door on that step there, in this position, crouching position, as if she was tied up.
And she was supposed to have jumped up to ring the bell?
To ring the bell, yeah.
Show me again, could you jump up from there to ring a bell?
No, I couldn't even leave the ground in this position.
A troubling idea took hold in the minds of Hill and Young.
Peter and I walked out into the night, and on our way back to the hotel, and I said to him, or he said to me, I don't remember, I don't think this actually happened.
Could it be possible that this could go all through our courts when a crime didn't occur, and nevertheless this fellow gets sent down for 5 years when the crime had not happened?
Once we discovered that there was a possibility that she'd made it all up, then we thought that we really had a story. And we called it the case of the perfect proof, which was a little bit of hubris.
This overconfidence led Hill and Young down a path that would define their future. They decided they must find and interview Anne Fitzpatrick herself, even though by now she had left Britain.
Finding Anne Fitzpatrick goes into investigative technique Well, first of all, we had to find out where she'd gone. All we'd heard was she'd gone to America. And it took 8 different people. We had to hire a researcher who had no attachment to the programme at all. She did a survey about the local area in Manchester. She went into the home of the parents of Anne Fitzpatrick and found out that Anne had gone to Los Angeles, she had a job as a nanny there, and indeed her parents were going to see her in a few weeks' time. So we set up an operation whereby we had somebody stationed outside the house, got the car number of the taxi that picked them up to go to the airport. We had people stationed along the way to the airport. So we trailed them right to the queue where we already had people in the queue waiting. It was a person in front of them who took the address off the suitcases. We then phoned it through to San Francisco where we had a reporter standing by. He drove down to Los Angeles, but he also took photos of her to make sure that he got the right woman. And he sent them back to England, and that's how we found her.
Hill led the team to Fitzpatrick for the interview that would form the climax of their programme.
When we first approached her, she pretended to be American, saying she knew nothing of any court case in Manchester. But then, eventually, she told the truth.
I was very emotionally upset, and at that time I thought I'd been burgled, and I now want to make that matter clear that I was not burgled, and that it was a figment of my imagination.
So that Anthony Mycock is innocent?
Yes, he is.
Do you regret that now?
Yes, very much so. Very much so.
And what are your feelings about Anthony Mycock, the man in jail?
I feel sick. I feel very, very, very sad.
What would you now like to see happen for him?
To be taken out of prison immediately, to be released, and well, I'd like to put my arms around him and say, tell him I was sorry.
The team were left in no doubt.
On Rough Justice, we've been investigating alleged miscarriages of justice for 5 years. The case of Anthony Mycock is the most outrageous case we've ever come across. A man not only convicted of a crime he did not commit, but a man in prison for 2 years for a crime that never even happened. In the past, it has taken the Home Office as long as 2 years to release our previous cases. Surely, with this devastating new evidence, they must release Anthony Mycock now. Surely, they can't leave him in prison for a crime that never happened.
The case of the perfect proof was shown on the 3rd of October, 1985. Events unfolded remarkably quickly. The appeal court was convened within weeks, and presiding over it was none other than the Lord Chief Justice himself, Lord Lane. On the back of the Rough Justice interview, he declared Fitzpatrick's testimony to be unreliable, and Mycock was released.
Freed after a television programme, the man who shouldn't have been jailed.
But Lane also decreed that while Mycock was innocent, the burglary itself had indeed happened, and his judgment carried the hint of trouble ahead.
When Lord Justice Lane let Mycock out, he said, "Reluctantly, we uphold the appeal." Well, how dare he? It's either a just appeal or it's not. Don't be reluctant about it.
Mycock's release was not to be the main story of this appeal. Many were left asking why the head of the judiciary, who generally heard the most important cases of the day, had chosen to preside over a case of minor burglary.
We soon found out, because they were there to put the heaviest of judicial boots in on these journalists who had dared to suggest that they could possibly perform legal business better than lawyers.
I thought, and Peter thought, that we were going to the court simply to verify that we had been there in California, and that those were the words that she said. How naive of us.
Unknown to Hill and Young, Fitzpatrick was now insisting the journalists had intimidated her into giving the interview.
Miss Fitzpatrick returned to Britain to be a witness at the appeal court. Under oath, she returned to her original story. There had been a robbery, Tony Mycock was involved, and she changed her mind in the TV interview only because she was under pressure from the Rough Justice team.
Fitzpatrick's revised statement was a serious allegation against the journalists.
Her cleverness was to say that, and it gave Lane the chance to say, oh, well, clearly these BBC people have overstepped themselves.
Mycock's case was highlighted in a BBC television programme, Rough Justice, shown in October. Today, Lord Lane said the programme had used outrageous methods in what he called investigation by menaces.
Lord Lane used the bulk of his summing up not to discuss the wrongful conviction of Mycock, but to attack the BBC journalists.
In his judgment, Lord Lane was highly critical of the pressure which he said the Rough Justice team had put on Anne Fitzpatrick.
What came to a head there was the utter white-hot anger and frustration of the higher judiciary, in particular Lord Lane. Lord Lane had grown up in this cloister, as so many of them do, of the criminal justice system, and he'd reached the peak of it, and it was his life, and he cherished it. And like so many people in the law, you think you've actually perfected the system, especially the British system. And then these twerps from the telly come in, who aren't even lawyers, and start poking their finger in it.
He had it in for broadcasters, Rough Justice and the BBC, and was determined to extract his pound of flesh from the production team and the BBC, which he duly did.
The Lord Chief Justice had turned the spotlight on the Rough Justice team and their methods.
We asked her a lot of questions, and we put the evidence that we'd got in front of her from her flatmates and so on, yes, of course. But the idea that we would try and get an interview by duress is daft. Of course we wouldn't.
The only thing we did with Anne Fitzpatrick that you might in any way classify like that was make her understand that we were serious about this, that we were here, we were going to stay here, we wanted an interview with her because it was her right of reply, but we had a lot of evidence in Manchester that she watched of what she'd done, that an innocent man was in jail because of what she'd said and done.
Hill and Young now found themselves in the place all journalists dread. They themselves had become the story.
The newspapers concentrated more on the criticism of the Rough Justice team than they did on the fact that Mr. Mycock had been released. And a great deal of play was made in several papers about the, quotes, bad behaviour, close quotes, of the team when they visited Miss Fitzpatrick in California.
Even some Liberal commentators questioned their actions.
Confessions made under threats are never reliable. They're not worth the videotape that they're carried on. These two researchers had done so much to build up its reputation, which is now partly destroyed as a result of their going over the line.
In Parliament, the Prime Minister herself criticised the BBC over the programme.
The Thatcher government certainly wasn't going to spurn this opportunity of being able to put the boot in on the BBC all over again. This just fitted into a sequence of events which actually represented a clash between investigative journalism and the establishment.
The timing could not have been worse. Just months earlier, the BBC had been censored by the government over a documentary featuring controversial footage of leaders from both sides of the political divide in Northern Ireland. The programme's interview with Sinn Féin's Martin McGuinness in particular was accused of being sympathetic to alleged terrorists.
I think Rough Justice runs into problems partly because the BBC is running into problems every which way and what way. And one of the very interesting things about the Mycock case is that the BBC ends up in the courts. Well, the BBC's in the courts about everything.
Locked in battle with the government, the BBC could ill afford to take on the Lord Chief Justice as well. Its top executives found that Hill and Young were in breach of journalistic guidelines.
As in many organisations, they had to do something, and that something was to discipline both Peter Hill and Martin Young. The punishment was that they would never work on investigative programmes again.
The methods used by the journalists were criticised in the appeal court, and following an internal inquiry, the BBC is suspending the journalists Martin Young and Peter Hill.
The BBC should have said, we stand by our story. We had the evidence on film, and they didn't stand by us.
I think it was a particularly shoddy way, particularly the way Peter Hill was treated. He brought this idea to the BBC. There are few enough people who care about miscarriages of justice, God knows. And to get rid of that particular aspect of Peter Hill's work, I thought was deplorable and craven. And as someone said to me, you can always rely on the BBC to let you down in these circumstances.
Hill and Young weren't the only casualties of this cycle of conflict between broadcasters and government. 12 months later, Special Branch raided the offices of a BBC team investigating a secret military spy satellite. The government took Director General Alastair Milne's scalp over the affair.
For the first time in 40 years, a Director General of the BBC has resigned his post. Alastair Milne left the corporation at lunchtime today. Personal reasons were given for his departure, but tonight there's speculation at Westminster that he was asked to leave.
The fall of Alastair Milne signalled a political blow to investigative journalism. It symbolised the end of one era of British television and the start of another. With the arrival of satellite television and a proliferation of channels, the BBC's focus increasingly became competition with other broadcasters. The era of almost constant tension with government was slipping away. Surprisingly, Rough Justice survived, still able to point to strong viewing figures and successes in the appeal court. A new team filled the boots of Hill and Young.
Most murders are family affairs, and for the police, most family murders are fairly simple affairs.
Everything changed. It was a completely new team. I came in, a new producer came in, John Smithson. None of us had really done anything like this before.
This was a different production, its confidence shaken.
We knew that there was an unhappy Lord Chief Justice. We knew that there was a government and a Prime Minister that were prepared to be belligerent. So I was aware when I took the job that I would be walking on eggshells. I knew that sort of 2 strikes and we were out.
Those head wounds would have bled profusely. When we went back to the pathologist who conducted the post-mortem, he estimated a blood loss of about half a pint.
In came a new studio-based visual style, but the goal of producing new evidence to quash unsafe convictions remained the same.
Rough Justice has analysed that confession line by line. In many respects, it's an unsatisfactory document which told the police nothing they couldn't have known already. With the new evidence we've uncovered, much of it now seems barely credible.
I got the impression that maybe lots of people, not within journalism, but with other side of the fence, as it were, would have been happy for us to make a mistake because that would have been the stick with which we could have been beaten. And that would have been the thing that would have caused the BBC to have taken Rough Justice off the air. So I was proud, probably above all, just of keeping miscarriages of justice very much alive.
Rough Justice did more than just keep the issue alive. It had set a ball rolling which was about to bring the problem of miscarriages to unprecedented public attention. In 1975, 2 groups of people had been imprisoned for IRA bombings of pubs. But the Guildford 4 and the Birmingham 6 insisted they were innocent, and campaigns to secure their release were formed. As the 1980s came to a close, the clamour to clear them had reached fever pitch.
Rough Justice paved the way for the opening of minds in relation to considering that the convictions of the Irish cases, the Birmingham 6, the Guildford 4, could possibly be miscarriages of justice in the public mind.
Yet Rough Justice itself did not take up either of these Irish cases.
I think if there was one strategic error, it was not taking head-on the Irish cases.
Rough Justice wanted to concentrate, in a sense, on the little cases that they knew otherwise would stand no chance whatever of publicity. So therefore, at the very moment when it should have been central to the debate, it was actually peripheral to it.
Other television programmes covered the stories.
Granada had, as it were, bagged the Birmingham 6. Yorkshire had, as it were, bagged the Guildford 4. And there's no point in two different teams doing the same thing.
In 1989, the Guildford Four were released on appeal.
The Guildford Four go free and British justice goes on trial.
The Birmingham Six followed in 1991.
The judiciary reacted to those cases with grave concern. There have been many changes since, both judge-led and statutory, to reflect the lessons learned. To take one fundamental example, the prosecution's duty of disclosure, which, in short, requires it to disclose to the defence any otherwise unused material which it has in its possession which might undermine its own case or assist the defence case, lies at the heart of a fair trial, and it had not been complied with in those cases. Therefore, the judiciary sought to further delineate the duty of disclosure and to enforce compliance with it.
In a 2-year period, a total of 37 out of 38 convictions brought to the Court of Appeal were quashed. But Rough Justice, the programme that in a way started all this, had to watch from the sidelines. In 1992, it was reduced to just one programme a year.
You're working on several different cases at the same time. And if you're told that you can only do one of these cases, you begin to ask yourself, well, what do I do with all this evidence that I have that points to the possible innocence of someone who's in prison at the moment? Do we keep them in prison for another year until it suits the convenience of the controller of BBC One?
Jessel and virtually his entire team left the BBC for Channel 4.
We wanted to take a general legal series to Channel 4 and see if they would entertain that. And we were told, no, Michael Grade's not interested in that. Tell you what Michael Grade is interested in. Michael Grade would love Rough Justice.
The Channel 4 series would be called Trial and Error, and would be Rough Justice in all but name. Back at the BBC, yet another new team took over at Rough Justice.
From the day they returned home to Sheffield, the Druids have justified their silence about the murder with their so-called Code of Honour. The code is intended to stop club members from grassing on each other. But how much honour is there in a code when it's used to keep an innocent man locked up?
To fit in more with the changing television landscape, the programme became glossier, with more of the money going on screen. The simple drawings were gone. Actors now recreated the crimes.
And they play hard.
Towards the end of the 90s, the series turned its attention to a case known as the M25 Iii.
On Thursday, 15th December 1988, a series of terrifying crimes took place along the Surrey stretch of the newly built M25. By the end of the night, 7 people had been brutally attacked and 1 was dead.
The police were under a lot of pressure to arrest this particular gang who they claimed were responsible for this spate of robberies. And so I was charged with what was described as the M25 Iii killing spree. I was convicted of murder and 3 counts of robbery and was sentenced to life with a recommendation of 50-something years.
Raphael Rowe had already spent 10 years in prison when the Rough Justice film examining his case aired in 1998. The programme publicised new evidence which demonstrated that a key witness was a police informer who had been paid for his evidence against Rowe.
3 days after the murder, he went to see a police officer contact. He gave him the names of Rowe and Davis.
I gave the police the guys' names and addresses. That's never been publicised though. That was the actual informant. I should return to it again. So he said, you're willing to give a statement? I said, because I did hear on the radio that there was a £25,000.
This recording demonstrated the unreliability of the key witness statement.
I sat there and watched Rough Justice and heard for the very first time and saw for the very first time the key witness in my case admit the evidence that we were denied for 12 years. That put something back in me that had gone the moment I was convicted.
It was not just rough justice that had become interested in Rowe's case. In 1997, an independent body was created to investigate suspected miscarriages of justice. The Criminal Cases Review Commission, or CCRC, was a response to failings exposed by the Irish cases. It was the first body of its kind in the world.
The CCRC is undoubtedly a valuable extension of the system, particularly because it provides an independent, responsible and continuing safety net by which to catch potential miscarriages of justice and to put them right.
This was the very thing which Tom Sargent, whose organisation Justice had kick-started and sustained rough justice, had argued for since the 1960s.
He did develop this idea that there was, a court of last resort or another body which could take up these issues. Now, he died in the late 80s, 88, so he never saw the Criminal Cases Review Commission. But it was what Justice argued for. I think the germ of it was his idea, and so, yeah, it was a posthumous achievement for him when it was established.
The Criminal Cases Review Commission had taken on the Raphael Rowe case at the same time as rough justice. In the year 2000, the Commission brought his case to appeal, and Rowe finally walked free.
Free after more than a decade behind bars, Raphael Rowe and Michael Davis emerged from the court understandably angry. What they said was a terrible miscarriage.
Would never have happened. I was 19 years old when they put me in prison. I'm 32 years old now. 12 years of my life lost, gone, forever. I'll never, ever get those years back.
I've been seriously damaged by my ordeal. I found a lot of things very difficult. But what helped me more than anything was the opportunity I got to become a journalist.
Unlike Jock Russell 15 years earlier, Rowe was able to rebuild his life thanks to studies he'd undertaken in prison.
Did a correspondence course whilst I was in prison. To get journalists interested in my situation, I needed to understand more about journalism.
Following his release, Rowe got a lucky break into journalism.
It was a chance meeting with the then editor of the Today programme on Radio 4 that started the second phase of my life.
In 2002, Rowe became a reporter for BBC Radio 4's Today programme. With Rowe's release thanks to the Criminal Cases Review Commission, it seemed as if television investigations into miscarriages had become redundant.
I think the setting up of the CCRC removed from public service broadcasters the feeling that this was an area that they had a duty to look into and to investigate and to televise it.
Nearly everyone who was involved in making miscarriages programmes wanted a criminal cases review body. They kept saying there isn't an official way of looking into miscarriages, and it was created. A great thing to do that. But by doing that, you could argue that the grounds for making programmes about it, about having dedicated units, was somewhat undermined.
It gave them the opportunity to say, well, OK, we can leave this to the CCRC and we can move on and we can do other things.
The institution that had helped free Rowe was now helping undermine rough justice. In 2000, David Jessel left investigative television altogether to become a commissioner on the Criminal Cases Review Commission.
The CCRC was like kind of the nationalisation of the miscarriage of justice industry, as it were.
The Criminal Cases Review Commission seemed to provide the solution. The judicial system had been fixed, and journalists began to look for other causes to champion. Come the early 2000s, the effectiveness of British justice was being questioned from a very different perspective. A perception that crime was rising and criminals were escaping punishment was taking hold.
There's no doubt that the criminal justice system has been failing a lot of people, especially in kind of areas where I represent, poor inner city areas, where a lot of youths are running out of control. We're not talking about organised crime, we're talking about disorganised crime.
It is the culture.
In 2006, the Labour government seized on this groundswell.
The time has come to rebalance the system so that we restore the faith of victims and witnesses that the court hearing, and indeed the criminal justice system, will be fair to all the people affected by it. So that we restore their confidence that a criminal will indeed be brought to justice.
Legislation soon followed this seminal 2006 speech, aimed at helping courts achieve more guilty verdicts.
The Prime Minister promises the justice system a makeover. Can he do that and keep it just? Good evening. To get a system of justice fit for the 21st century, the Prime Minister says ancient legal safeguards will have to be jettisoned.
It had always been assumed that there were various pillars underpinning the criminal justice system, but these were swept away under the Labour governments of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. Protection against double jeopardy, gone. Habeas corpus, gone. Can't be convicted on hearsay evidence, gone. Can't be convicted on anonymous evidence, gone. Bad character evidence brought into trials, previous convictions brought into trials, and even, as it were, the inner sanctum of trial by jury, that too was gone because they said you could be tried by judge alone in some circumstances.
Series that reflected the new emphasis on catching the bad guys and making them pay. Set among the unreconstructed environment of 1970s policing, the huge popularity of Life on Mars mirrored a nostalgia for the bad old days of police work that Rough Justice had done so much to expose.
In that the DCI, whose approach is hardly human rights compliant, and his management style is appalling, becomes the hero because it's that type of tough police pillar until you end up on the wrong end of it. And that's the dilemma. And until you're a victim who wants a decent professional service, or until you're a suspect who gets mistreated by a police officer acting that way, actually as a sort of citizen standing back, maybe your cops making sure that the bad guys are dealt with because they're other people is okay. Actually, it's not okay at all.
With the zeitgeist on the side of catching criminals at all costs, the process of proving someone innocent all but disappeared from TV screens.
In terms of the journalistic agenda and what programme makers feel that the public are interested in, I think it's terrible to put it this way, but it's slightly gone, miscarriages of justice, slightly gone out of fashion as an issue, and we're much more interested in looking at the legal system and the police system in other ways.
Changes within television added to the decline of the miscarriage story.
Television worries enormously about audiences. It worries about the commissioning structures and how the audiences are going to be reached. And on the whole, what that's led to is a greater degree of centralisation and more power vested in the hands of the channel controllers and the commissioners in particular genres, and less of the kind of small little units, the places where people are getting on with doing other things and come out and surprise you. It's not a kind of deliberate thing, but Rough Justice was very much a victim of that.
Despite shrinking resources, in 2007, under producer Simon Ford, Rough Justice defied the odds and broadcast its first film in 2 years.
This is the story of a brutal murder, a burglary that led to the death of a 79-year-old woman. But it is also the story of a man who says he was nowhere near the crime, but has been jailed for life for murder.
The programme reflected the diminished status of Rough Justice. Lacking the resources to conduct its own investigation, the film followed a group of undergraduate students conducting independent research into the case of Simon Hall, a man imprisoned for murder in 2001.
Good morning. Can I speak to Professor Jameson, please? This is Gabby from the University of Bristol Innocence Project.
The students were part of the Innocence Network, a Bristol University-based organisation dedicated to reinvestigating suspected miscarriages of justice. Across the country, hundreds of students contribute their free time to this volunteer organisation. The Simon Hall case required complex scientific analysis.
The evidence against Simon was a trail of fibres found at the murder scene, which the prosecution say matched fibres found at Simon's home and in his car. However, the fingerprints found at the scene were not Simon's. The police found no DNA evidence at all to link him to the murder.
The fibre evidence at the heart of Hall's conviction demonstrated how the nature of reinvestigating criminal cases had shifted.
In the Simon Hall case, the conviction in the end was mainly based on the examination of fibres. So we have scientific evidence taking over cases and dominating them. Historically, I think convictions were obtained largely on witness evidence, whereas the game had changed now completely. And what we had was a new situation where convictions were far more likely to be obtained in highly technological areas like CCTV, mobile phones, computer evidence, even sat-navs, and of course there's DNA evidence.
The high-tech nature of modern detective work underpins the explosive growth of the crime scene investigation TV genre, kick-started by the American CSI franchise, launched in the year 2000. The fascination with forensic procedures has since bled into all areas of television.
To the untrained eye, a crime scene can appear to have no clues. But to a crime scene investigator, or CSI, they're everywhere.
While modern forensics were providing a boon for TV, the resources required to interpret the huge sets of data produced were making defending and reinvestigating cases incredibly complex and often prohibitive. The students investigating Simon Hall's case were on the right track, but reinterpreting the fibre evidence was too complex.
You don't have anything yet to suggest that the evidence that was given at trial was wrong in any way. Yeah. And you've got to really focus on that. You have not got anything. There are lots of question marks.
The students couldn't find the new evidence they needed. Rough justice could not help Simon Hall. In 2007, Rough Justice was cancelled, 25 years after it reopened the case of Jock Russell. Simon Hall, like anyone else believing themselves to be the victim of a miscarriage, would have to rely on the Criminal Cases Review Commission. Yet there are questions over how much the Commission can achieve.
I think there are still a number of issues with the CCRC. The level of resources are constantly dwindling. The level of work is constantly rising at the CCRC. So I think in that respect there is still a big investigative gap for the media.
Prisoner number So with some criticism of the Criminal Cases Review Commission beginning to be generated, is there still a need for a programme like Rough Justice?
I'd have thought it would be relatively easy for the BBC to justify such a thing, provided it wasn't politically biased, provided it was doing its investigations without fear or favour, and provided it was not seeking to make a political point. Embarrassing the judicial system, I think, is absolutely fine and is merited if the judicial system has been proved to be wrong or wanting in some way.
To challenge your views and learn more about the justice system, go to bbc.co.uk/justice and follow the links to the Open University.
The Law Lords speak in BBC4's Justice season, and it's a real eye-opener. We enter the highest court in the land next, and then coming up at 11, we question some eyewitnesses.